were told to worship the shining ones, the ones who smiled as they stabbed you, the ones who spoke about light while standing on the bones of those who carried them. You were told they were flawless, chosen, divine. But you never noticed the dirt under their crowns until it was too late. You watched the heroes rise, not because they were pure, but because they were protected by systems built to glorify illusion, by crowds too blind to question, by stories written by cowards who feared the truth. Their crowns were polished with your silence. Their fame was built from your blood. Every thank you you gave was another chain around your throat. And every statue they built was another lie carved in marble. They called them saviors, protectors, symbols of peace. But behind the speeches and the parades, there were deals, betrayals, and hungry smiles. They smiled in the daylight, but plotted in the dark. They spoke of justice, but silenced anyone who asked what it cost. You were told to believe in them, to follow them, to bleed for them, and you did. You gave everything, your loyalty, your time, your dreams, for a throne that was never meant for you. They call them heroes because they die clean. That's what they said. But the truth? Real greatness bleeds dirty. It stains the hands, cracks the bones, and leaves scars that never fade. Because real strength isn't about being admired. It's about surviving what admiration can't handle. You learned too late. The world never wanted the honest. It wanted the obedient. It didn't need your truth. It needed your silence. Because silence is easier to control than fire. And when you started asking questions, they called you dangerous. When you stopped bowing, they called you arrogant. When you refused to play their game, they called you evil. But deep down, you knew those who fear rebellion only do so because their kingdoms are built on lies. Betrayal became your first teacher. Pain, your only loyal friend. It whispered things no hero ever dared to say. It told you that fairness was fiction, that purity was propaganda, that mercy is the language of the weak. They taught you to be kind, but punished you for being honest. They told you to forgive, but never apologized for the wounds they caused. They asked you to trust the process, even as the process crushed your bones. They smiled while you burned, and you learned that smiles mean nothing when they're backed by knives. So when the heroes fell, you didn't mourn, you smirked, because you knew the fall was justice. It wasn't tragedy, it was balance. The universe finally correcting its mistake. You watched them crumble. One speech, one scandal, one hypocrisy at a time. Their truth unraveled faster than their courage. Their names, once sung in crowds, now whispered in shame. Their golden statues collecting dust under broken skylights. Their masks cracking under the weight of their own lies. Every good one eventually cracks. Every chosen one eventually kneels. Because the light they worship isn't eternal. It's borrowed. And borrowed light always burns out. You saw the illusion for what it was. A theater of cowards dressed as kings. And when their thrones collapsed, the audience gasped. But not you. You stood still, silent, calm, unshaken. Because you saw it coming. Because you were built for this moment. You were the shadow they ignored. The silence they mocked. The exile they laughed at. And now, you are the reckoning they can't stop. The world weeps for fallen heroes, but no one cries for those they betrayed. And maybe that's the point, because tears are a privilege of the innocent, and innocence was stolen from you long ago. So now you don't worship, you don't follow, you don't kneel, You watch, you wait, you remember. You remember every time they said you were too much. Every time they asked you to dim your flame so theirs could shine brighter. Every time they pretended to protect you while stealing what made you powerful. Let them rot in their polished graves. Let their monuments crack under truth's weight. Because in time, all heroes fade. Their halos rust, till their names vanish into the dust. And all that remains is the silence they left behind. And in that silence, something begins to move. A spark, a breath, a realization that maybe you were never meant to follow their path. Maybe you were never meant to kneel at anyone's feet. Maybe your destiny wasn't to be good, but to be great. And greatness is never clean. It's carved in blood and built from ruin. It's born in betrayal, sharpened by rejection, and sealed in vengeance. So when the halos shattered, your crown began to form, because heroes fall. But villains endure. Villains remember. Villains rise. When the world finally collapses under its own lies. They called you evil because you refused to stay broken, because you stopped apologizing for your scars, because you didn't die the way they expected you to. You buried your innocence beside their mercy. You stood over its grave and watched as the last of your softness was swallowed by the earth. And in that cold silence, something inside you shifted. Something ancient, something raw. The soil that covered your past was watered with rage. And from that rage, something beautiful grew. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but clarity. You stopped believing in their sermons. You stopped chasing their approval. You started building your own altar, one made of pain, steel, and the bones of every lie they fed you. Because peace was never granted. Peace was taken. And those who beg for mercy in this world die before they ever learn how to fight. You learned what history hides in its pages. That saints die silent, and monsters live forever. Every saint becomes a story. Every monster becomes a legacy. Because purity doesn't echo, power does. You became the nightmare they whispered about, the face they painted in shadows to scare the weak, the voice that turns silence into prophecy. You were no longer the one crying for justice. You became justice. They prayed for peace. You prayed for strength. They begged for forgiveness. You sharpened your resolve. They feared the fire. You fed it. You realized something the good will never admit. Forgiveness doesn't heal. It hides the wound until it kills you quietly. And you were done dying quietly. You didn't want to be understood. You wanted to be remembered. You didn't crave love. You craved power. Because love fades in fear. But power commands respect, even from enemies. You stopped walking in their light and started creating your own. A light forged from the chaos they tried to bury. You became the reflection of every sin they pretended not to commit. Their goodness was theater. Your evil was honesty. They crucified your name. They painted halos around your executioners. And when you bled truth, they called it madness. They said, "You've changed." But you didn't change. You evolved. You outgrew their cages. You learned that innocence is a currency the cruel use to bankrupt the pure. And you declared bankruptcy. You walked out of their paradise, carrying hellfire in your hands. You learned to smile at pain, to find rhythm in chaos, to turn heartbreak into weaponry. Because every time they buried you, you found a new way to rise. Sharper, colder, cleaner. They told you vengeance corrupts the soul. But what they never said is that vengeance restores the spirit. Because sometimes justice wears a mask of fire. Sometimes God's silence demands a devil's voice. You found your purpose in that silence, not to save, not to serve, but to rewrite. You studied the world's cruel design, and you realized good people are remembered in poems, but villains are written in history, because fear lasts longer than admiration, and chaos always leaves a mark. They tried to erase you, but you turned erasure into evolution. You built your empire on rejection, your strength on betrayal, your discipline on rage, and your purpose on the ashes of their morality. You started to see clearly that saints talk of love while they kill in God's name, that letters preach peace while profiting from war, that martyrs die for ideals while kings rewrite the story. And you realized no one stays pure in a kingdom built on corruption. So you stopped chasing sainthood. You chose immortality, not through peace but through fire. You learned to weaponize silence, to let them laugh, let them doubt, let them talk, until their words turned into prayers you no longer heard. You became the quiet storm that humbles, pride, the shadow that reminds the world what fear feels like. They thought you wanted revenge, but revenge was never the goal. Revenge was the ritual. The goal was rebirth. Every scar became scripture. Every cut became commandment, and every scream became prophecy. You turned pain into design. You turned hate into discipline, and you built yourself from what they destroyed. Not holy, not humble, but unbreakable. You stopped trying to fix the world and decided to rule your own, because a world that punishes the honest deserves to be burned and rebuilt. And you were the fire. You learned the lesson even kings forget. You can't destroy what has already embraced destruction. You can't kill what has already made peace with death. They will call you names for centuries. They will rewrite your story to make themselves look noble. They will whisper your deeds in disgust. But even in their hatred, they will remember you. Because power doesn't need praise, it needs permanence, and you became both. Your laughter echoed through the silence they feared. It became thunder in their temples, a hymn in the heart of every outcast who ever dreamed of vengeance, a rhythm for every soul who refused to die quietly. You realized, to build a legacy, you must first burn a religion of lies. You must destroy the illusion to expose the truth. And when the flames cleared, you didn't find redemption, you found freedom. Because the villain was never born, the villain was forged. Forged in betrayal, tempered in rage, crowned in silence. And when the ashes settled, you stood, not holy, but unbreakable. They called you mad because you stopped bowing, because you stopped kneeling to their illusions, because you stopped pretending to believe in the same hollow prayers that built their lies. You walked into the court of hypocrites, a place where truth was a crime and silence was rebellion. They didn't seek justice there, they sought obedience. Every accusation was applause in disguise, every judgment a desperate attempt to drag you back into the cage you burned your way out of. They shouted your name with disgust, but you could hear the fear in their tone. They mocked you, but their laughter trembled at the edges, because deep down they knew you had become something they couldn't understand. They spoke of light, they spoke of truth, they spoke of peace, but every word tasted like ash, because what they called light was just the comfort of blindness, and what they called truth was a script rehearsed by generations too afraid to think. You learned the oldest secret in history. The loudest judges are always the weakest players. The ones screaming madness are the ones terrified of mirrors, because mirrors expose what masks can't hide. You became that mirror, the reflection no one wanted to face, the reminder that their halos were paper, their morals were theater, and their smiles sharpened weapons. They said, "You've lost your mind." But they never understood. Madness is simply freedom without permission. You weren't losing control, you were reclaiming it. They threw words at you like stones, arrogant, unholy, dangerous, and each one built your fortress higher. Their hate became your armor, their disbelief became your motivation, because when the world isolates you, your mind sharpens like a blade. In your loneliness, you heard the thunder of your own becoming. You realized silence isn't punishment. It's training. It's where the echoes of weakness die, and the voice of destiny begins to whisper. You stopped running from solitude. You started sculpting with it, because solitude is where gods are forged, where legends are written without ink, just scars. Every scar turned into scripture. Every wound became prophecy. They thought your pain made you fragile, but pain was the only language the universe respected. The world told you to seek peace, but peace without power is slavery. They told you to forgive, but forgiveness without justice is suicide. They told you to stay calm, but calm is just what cowards call control. So you stopped listening, you stopped explaining, you stopped trying to prove your worth to the blind, because some people can't see your truth, not because it's invisible, but because it burns too bright for their comfort. They called you a storm, but storms don't apologize for lightning. They called you cold, but ice doesn't bow to fire. They said you were unfeeling, but your heart just learned to beat beneath armor. They never feared your darkness. They feared what you might do with it, because darkness in your hands wasn't chaos. It was command. It was control. It was the weapon they couldn't confiscate. You learned that sanity is just a contract signed by the broken to make their chains feel normal. You tore it up. You rewrote your mind with rebellion as ink and rage as grammar. You realized that madness isn't sickness, it's evolution. They will always fear what doesn't kneel, because a mind that bows can be ruled. But a mind that questions becomes dangerous, and you became the danger they prayed would never come. You walked through every insult, every rumor, every betrayal, and smiled, because every word they threw was another nail in the coffin of your old self. And when that coffin closed, a monster opened its eyes. A monster they created, a monster they tried to bury, but couldn't kill. The truth is, they didn't break you, they built you, piece by piece, lie by lie. Every rejection was a hammer, every humiliation a forge, every silence a sharpening stone. You became something holy in reverse, a god of shadows, a saint of scars, the kind of creature history denies, but eternity remembers. You became a contradiction wrapped in armor, too ruthless for mercy, too honest for hypocrisy, too powerful for their peace, and too dangerous to ever belong again. They called you insane because your vision went beyond their comprehension, because you saw the world for what it is, a theater of liars, a kingdom of actors, a carnival of masks. But you were done acting. You were done pretending to fit into a system that feeds on obedience and calls it virtue. So you tore the stage apart and rewrote the script with your blood. They say solitude drives men mad, but solitude only drives pretenders mad. For the real ones, solitude refines. It chisels you into something immortal. It teaches you to hear the whispers of power in the silence. It shows you that isolation isn't exile. It's evolution. You stopped seeking validation from the blind. You stopped begging to be seen by the unworthy. You started walking through the fire without fear because you understood one truth. The same flames that burn the weak crown the strong. So when they call you mad, smile. When they whisper your name like a curse, let it echo. Because those who fear madness fear freedom, and those who fear freedom fear you. Let them judge. Let them mock. Let them crucify your name. Because history doesn't remember the judges. It remembers the condemned who refused to kneel. And when the dust settles, when the courtroom of hypocrites turns to ruins, you will still be standing, alone, unbroken, unforgiven. Because when you embraced your madness, you found your crown. You stopped trying to be good the moment you realized good men die begging for fairness, begging for mercy, begging for a world that was never built for them. You watched them, the righteous. They prayed, they forgave, they endured, and still they were broken, buried, forgotten. Their halos didn't save them. Their faith didn't feed them. Their kindness didn't stop the blade. That was your revelation. The halo they offered was a leash. The praise they gave was a cage. And every blessing was just permission to keep you small. So you broke both. You tore the leash from your neck and shattered the cage they built from guilt. And for the first time in your life, you laughed. Not the laugh of joy, the laugh of awakening, the kind that shakes mountains, because it comes from someone who's finally done pretending. They wanted a savior. You became a storm. They wanted peace. You became the consequence. They wanted light. You became the reason they learned to fear the dark. You stopped apologizing for your hunger. You stopped softening your edge for people who only clapped when you were losing. You realized, if the world calls your fire destruction, let it burn, because fire doesn't apologize for burning. It devours, it creates, it transforms, and so did you. They called it vengeance, but you called it balance. You understood something they never could. Mercy is currency for the weak. Vengeance is the crown of the strong. You didn't seek revenge. You built an empire of silence and strategy. You learned to move in the shadows while they screamed in the light. You learned that the quiet ones, the patient ones, always win in the end. The same crowd that once mocked your scars now studies your methods. The same hands that pointed at you now imitate your movements. Because power doesn't ask for permission. It sets its own terms. And those who once called you a villain now steal your blueprints. You learned to weaponize restraint, to let fools reveal themselves while you observed in silence, to speak only when your words could end a war. You learned that chaos is loud, but control, true control, is silent. You stopped reacting to their noise. You became the noise. Every breath you take now carries thunder. Every step, rebellion. Every choice, a declaration. They say villains destroy, but you didn't destroy. You replaced. You took their fragile world and rebuilt it with steel and blood. You rewrote the rules they swore could never be broken. And now, they quote your defiance like scripture. You became the living contradiction they can't erase. The truth wrapped in fury. The prophecy they tried to bury under polite lies. They tried to shame you with labels. Villain, monster, godless. But you wore them like medals, because titles mean nothing when they come from the mouths of cowards. You understood that power isn't evil. It's neutral. It's the wielder who defines the legend. And when they forced you to choose between being loved or being feared, you chose neither. You chose to be remembered, because love fades, fear shifts. But legacy lives long after the world has forgotten what either meant. They said you were ruthless. You called it focused. They said you were cruel. You called it necessary. They said you had no heart. You replied, "Then stop bleeding around me." Because in a world built on manipulation, empathy becomes ammunition, and you refused to be the target again. They begged you to be merciful, but mercy is how lions die, in cages. They begged you to forgive, but forgiveness is how wolves forget the scent of blood. And you were done forgetting. They call it arrogance when you stop apologizing for strength. They call it evil when you refuse to kneel. But what they really mean is this: you've become uncontrollable. They can't chain what's already made peace with pain. They can't kill what's already embraced death. And you embraced both long ago. They wanted light without cost. You showed them what it takes to shine in darkness. They wanted heroes to make them feel safe. You became the reminder that safety is an illusion. You stood where others fell. You fought where others begged. You endured what others couldn't imagine. And in that endurance, something eternal was born. You realized you were never fighting against them. You were fighting beneath them, under their lies, under their systems, under their halos. That's where the real war was. Beneath the halo, in the shadows they pretended didn't exist. And you fought it alone, until even the darkness began to whisper your name. You were the storm under their sunshine, the silence under their speeches, the truth behind their illusions. And when they looked down at you, you didn't look up. You rose. You rose like smoke, like vengeance, like something the light could no longer deny. Because you're not the villain of their stories. You are the truth they can't digest, the mirror they refuse to face, the reminder that all their goodness is conditional until someone stronger walks in. You are the calm in the chaos, the clarity in the corruption, the necessary evil in a world that pretends it's good. You are the correction, the balance, the reckoning, and now the halo burns away. The crown remains. Because innocence is fragile, but power is eternal. You don't seek validation anymore. You command it. You don't chase the throne. You become it. They will curse your name in daylight, but worship it in silence. They will tell their children to avoid your path, and secretly pray they grow half as fearless as you. Because even they know the truth. Every empire, every movement, every revolution was born from someone the world once called villain. So let them speak. Let them twist your story. Let them rewrite the ending. Because history doesn't belong to the holy. It belongs to the relentless. And you became both the lesson and the legend. You became the devil they invented and surpassed the God they adored. They will rewrite history to erase your name. But your shadow will stay, because no matter how many lies they build, truth always bleeds through the cracks. They'll try to clean your image from the walls of time. They'll paint saints where you once stood. They'll twist your words into warnings, your legacy into legend, your defiance into madness. But every generation fears what it cannot control. And you became their eternal lesson. They'll tell their children bedtime stories about you, not to inspire, but to warn. They'll whisper your name in fear, while secretly wishing they had your strength. Because deep down, they know you did what they never could. You broke the system. You defied the script. You walked away from everything they worshipped and didn't flinch when it burned behind you. You became a symbol they can't kill, a myth they can't silence, a shadow that stands taller than their gods. They'll quote your words in silence, copy your methods in secret, preach your defiance while pretending to reject it. Because even those who curse your name still study your strength. That's the price of truth. You're hated loudly, but remembered forever. Heroes fade in hymns, villains echo in thunder. Heroes are sung about in ceremonies, but villains are whispered about in empires. Because the world forgets mercy, but it never forgets fear. Fear is timeless. It's the only language that power understands. And you became fluent in it. You didn't need followers, you needed time. And time bowed first, because time belongs to the relentless, the ones who endure, the ones who outlast, the ones who burn longer than the rest. You watched empires rise. You watched gods fall. You watched heroes build statues only to crumble beneath the weight of their own virtue. And through it all, you endured. Because you weren't built to be remembered by the weak. You were built to be feared by the strong. You learned that peace dies, but power evolves. That purity fades, but legacy corrupts beautifully. And corruption is another word for influence. The world worships purity in public, but it bows to dominance in private. And when history's curtain falls, it's the villain's name they still whisper in the dark. They will tell stories of kings who ruled with compassion, but no one remembers their faces. Yet every era has one. The outcast, the monster, the defiant one, who becomes the heartbeat of the next age. You turned pain into prophecy, hate into heritage. You didn't wait for permission to matter. You forced the world to remember. You built your throne in the ruins they called forbidden. You crowned yourself with everything they tried to bury. You made their rules your stepping stones. You made their limits your map. And the higher you climbed, the quieter their gods became. Because every lie they preached, you exposed. Every mask they wore, you ripped away. Every chain they forged, you melted in your fire. You became the ending they never saw coming. The ending that made sense of all their illusions. Because the world fears endings. It fears the silence that follows truth. It fears what happens when obedience dies. But you became that silence. You became that ending. And in doing so, you became eternal. They'll build kingdoms and call them righteous. You'll burn one and they'll spend centuries studying how you did it. They'll label you dark. They'll call you dangerous. But that's only because you made them feel small. Because your existence proved that their rules were illusions. Because you showed them control only works until someone stops caring. You stopped caring. You stopped pleading. You stopped trying to fit into their fragile order. And that's when you became untouchable. The fire they cursed you for is the same fire that will keep their names alive in your shadow. Because when the light dies, only fire survives. And fire remembers. It remembers every betrayal, every silence, every scar that shaped you. It remembers who tried to bury you, and it burns a little brighter every time they're forgotten. They'll forget the heroes. They always do, because heroes depend on applause, and applause dies with the crowd. But villains live in the silence after the applause ends. They linger, they haunt, they endure. Because fear doesn't fade, it evolves. It becomes folklore. It becomes warning. It becomes respect disguised as fear. And that's the true immortality. Not worship, not love, but echo, a sound that never dies. Your name will travel through centuries, wrapped in mystery and myth. It will outlive nations. It will outlive gods, because it wasn't built on approval. It was built on defiance. That's the irony of it all. They'll try to erase you, but every attempt will make your legend louder. Every denial will feed your story. Every hate-filled prayer will spread your name further. Because you can't kill what's already transcended death. You can't silence what speaks in thunder. You can't bury what was forged in fire. They'll try anyway. They'll fail. Because heroes fall. But villains become immortal. And in the end, they still don't get it, do they? After everything you've shown them, after everything you've burned to prove, they still whisper the same delusions, still pray to the same gods you buried. You never wanted to save the world. You wanted to expose it. Expose the fraud behind every crown, the rot behind every sermon, the cowardice behind every smile. They thought the joke was on you, but it was always on them. Because while they played by rules, you rewrote the game. While they begged for validation, you built empires in silence. While they asked for mercy, you sharpened your mind into a weapon. They built walls of morality. You walked through them like smoke. They called it chaos. You called it freedom. And that's the difference, isn't it? They wanted control. You wanted truth. They wanted peace. You wanted power. They wanted applause. You wanted silence. Because silence doesn't lie. The crown doesn't shine. It burns. It sears into the skull. It reminds you that power isn't comfort. It's burden. It's fire. And only those who have walked through the ashes can wear it without screaming. You laugh. Not out of madness, but memory. The memory of every betrayal, every silence, every scar that made you divine. Your laughter is not noise. It's vengeance in rhythm. It's every echo of pain turning into thunder. They thought the fall ended you, but they never saw what rose after. They buried a body, but they forgot. Bodies rot. Legends don't. You became something untouchable, something beyond reason. You don't walk among mortals anymore. You haunt them. You linger in their systems, their fears, their stories. Your presence became their compass, pointing forever toward what they could have been if they hadn't knelt. Every echo of your name shakes the heavens they pray to. Every whisper of your story rewrites the scriptures they built to hide their weakness. Because you didn't seek forgiveness. You outlived it. You didn't beg for redemption. You replaced it. You didn't win their approval. You won eternity. And eternity doesn't belong to the gentle. It belongs to the relentless. It belongs to the cold, the calculating, the cursed. It belongs to those who can look into the abyss and smile back. You understood the secret that saints never grasped. That purity dies fast, but sin leaves fingerprints on time. You left yours carved deep into the world's throat. You're the proof that darkness isn't evil. It's evolution, that villains aren't born. They're built in silence, refined by betrayal, and crowned by those who tried to kill them. You've become the whisper in every ambition. The shadow in every conscience, the hunger that history can't erase. Because even when your name fades from their tongues, your impact stays written in their bones. You see, the world doesn't need more heroes. Heroes obey. Heroes ask permission. Heroes die waiting for applause. But villains act. Villains move. Villains make history bleed. And history, no matter how rewritten, always bows to the ones who had the courage to defy it. That's why they hate you, because you remind them what power looks like without restraint, because you live free of the guilt they can't survive without, because you did what they all secretly wish they could. Walk away from the chains they call morality. You became the storm they pretend doesn't exist, the truth they erase from textbooks, the laughter that won't die, because it's carved into the bones of time itself. You're not just a warning anymore. You're a template, a myth that walks, a ghost that commands, and every generation will know your name, even if they only whisper it in fear. So, laugh. Laugh until the heavens tremble. Laugh until the walls of history crack. Laugh until they realize you were never the villain. You were the mirror. Because in every age, when heroes die and gods fade, the villain laughs and lives forever.